could have had this in a meeting room.
Yep. You're making me laugh loud now.
Okay, let's wait for a few more minutes.
Sure. I'm going on mute. Let me know when I need to be on live.
Yep.
Right? Okay, I'm going on mute.
Hi, everyone. The EcoLabs webinar will begin very soon. Please sit back and relax for the time being. Okay, let's get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for EcoLabs webinar series. My name is Tas, Innovation Manager at EcoLabs Centre of Innovation for Energy, and I'll be hosting this session. Let me start with a brief introduction of EcoLabs. EcoLabs Centre of Innovation for Energy enables and accelerates innovation capabilities in Singapore to support nation's future energy transition. This joint initiative with the Nanyang Technological University, Enterprise Singapore, and Sustainable Energy Association of Singapore aims to help localize energy, starting them with essential translation facilities and connections, such as research and development manpower, lab infrastructure, testbed sites, and business opportunities to help them successfully commercialize and scale the innovation efforts. Today's webinar is a panel discussion on public and private sources of funding for startups and SMEs. The panelists with whom we'll have this conversation today are Mahesh Kumar, Program Director at EcoLabs in the blue corner of the ring, and Charles Ludwig, Investment Director at EcoLabs red team in the red corner. Mahesh will be covering public funding sources, and Charles will be representing available private funding options for startups and SMEs. Mahesh, Charlie, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, Stas.
And just before we proceed further, dear participants, at the end of this session, we'll have around 10 minutes for Q&A. So if during our discussion, you would like to clarify something, just please feel free to type in your questions in a dedicated Zoom sections called Q&A at the bar chart below. So let's get started our panel discussion with the quick speaker introduction. Mahesh, may I ask you to briefly introduce yourself and your role at EcoLabs?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Tess. Hey, hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Mahesh here. I actually lead the EcoLabs Centre of Innovation for Energy. Prior to this, I've been handling the startup and commercialization activity of Energy Research Institute at NTU. My predominant background is largely spin-off startups and commercialization. My interest to join in this panel is to ensure that we share what we know about the Singapore ecosystem on public funding sources, and as well as how we can support startups with raising funds and so forth. So thank you, Stas, for having me here today.
Thank you, Mahesh. And Charlie, can you also please share in a few words what's your role at EcoLabs?
Sure. So I've recently joined with EcoLabs. My responsibilities are in the venture capital side to help liaise with the VCs, investors, as well as with startups and SMEs. Prior to my role here at EcoLabs, I worked with the Oman Sovereign Wealth Fund in venture capital in the Middle East. And prior to that, I was in venture capital here in Singapore with another private fund as well. So I'm glad to be here, Stas. Thanks for organizing.
Awesome. Thank you, Charlie. I think we'll start our discussion maybe from a high-level overview, just to understand what is where. So I would like to ask Mahesh maybe to share maybe the most common public funding sources in Singapore, just to give us a high-level overview.
Yeah, sure, Seth. The most common funding on a public source, which I would say, since we are principally funded from Enterprise Singapore, and if you're largely startups and SMEs from Singapore, I think the first source of funding you should look is what Enterprise Singapore offers. And given that it varies and it is well structured in different form, so startups which are pretty early, which are forming its idea, so there's a separate type of grants and name them. There are startups which are maturing itself from lab to market. There are different types of startup funding and equity funding you have. Then startups which are trying to commercialize and go outside, not only within the Singapore. And there are different types of funding available. All these are public sources of funding. So let me start first. The first type of funding, which given that we are facing tough times, the government is extremely kind, again, helping Singapore startups and SME. The first grant is called SG Founder Grant. Which was $30,000 before. With the recent announcement, it moves to $50,000 per startup. It has to be a Singapore founder. It has to be a first-time founder. It's largely to explore a basic business idea before you could jump in. So that's the first kind of scheme which you can look at. The second type of scheme, when you're especially looking at developing an IP-backed ideas, the most common grant which we generally like to touch upon, which we call ESG Tech. Under ESG Tech, there are two types, which is POC and POV. The POC is 250K grant support, and the POV is 500K support to it. This predominantly applies in terms of TRL. If the technology readiness level, I would still recommend companies which has post POC to apply for POV grants, which is up to $500,000, and companies which are nearing POC to apply for a POC grant, which is 250K. So that helps you to push your idea from proof of concept to proof of value. Once you hit the phase, then you probably have a different types of public funding grant, which is available from Enterprise Singapore. So companies and SMEs which are fairly matured or which wants to build a new innovation or a capability, they should touch upon public funding, which is not necessarily equity based, but you should touch upon EDG grants. Under EDG, there are subtle differences in the EDG. Under EDG, you have the process and product and innovation capability building grant. The other one which you have is pilot testing and overseas market presence grant. So these all help you to use these public funding sources available in a different way. So a startup would typically should position when it is core capability, leverage the EDG grant. When it is about overseas market entry, it's about piloting across, leverage the other side of the EDG grant. Apart from that, you also have an MRA grant, which helps a startup to establish its presence in a foreign market entity. So those are some very solid Enterprise Singapore grant system, which you can touch upon if you really consider it's right from the idea phase all the way to market entry. Yes, they all have different maturity. They take different time zones. So that's one. I would also touch upon different types of grants over the call. You could also go for a new grant, which NRF is championing, which has been very popular among the MNCs, which is the IF ICP grant, which now needs to be focused on SMEs, which is a lovely news. I would expect the SMEs to also look into these grants if they're looking at research and building capability on fundamentally on deep tech. So these are some of the sources to start with, Stas, and maybe over the call I'll get into further.
Sure, sure. Thank you for such a comprehensive overview, Mahesh.
Yep.
I think we'll definitely dive deeper into these sources.
Sure.
So, and meanwhile, Charlie, can you please also give us an overview? What kind of private funding sources are there? What options are available for startups and SMEs?
Happy to. Look, I think private funding behaves very similarly in terms of different types of investors at different stages of the life cycle of a startup. So in Southeast Asia, especially here in Singapore, one of the most prominent places to begin with is the angel investors. Angel investors are easily located in a number of locations. They either are part of angel networks like BANSI, or they would be individuals that are where you're able to find them by attending some of the startup events that just generally or naturally occur here in Singapore. Once you start moving up the food chain and maturity of a business from pre-seed, which is typically your prototype, or even your, even as early as a lab stage type of startup, into something that's now commercialized and perhaps even secured its first customer, you're now moving into that seed stage. And in that stage, you're going to find a lot of money is held within those smaller stage VCs, and they do differentiate themselves based on stage. A great place to start looking is a resource called Map of the Money. It's a website in Singapore that helps organize a number of these VCs. And that then carries on from seed stage all the way to the late stage. The higher up the food chain you go in maturity, the closer and closer you get towards those corporate VC players. Corporates, especially in the clean tech topic, corporates are a significant contributor towards clean tech startups. It's one place that they're quite active. And so for that reason, you will find there's a number of corporates that either on their websites or through a quick search, there's a number of resources like E27 and other online resources that will create these lists of corporates. Some of the more popular ones include B Capital. You have Shell Ventures, you have Total Ventures. So there are a number of these either and surprisingly in industries that are perhaps sometimes unrelated to clean tech. You'll find that these corporates are pivoting towards a clean tech focus and drive.
Sorry, yeah, Stas, maybe I can just chip in. Charlie, maybe just to add some more names to it. It's
Sure.
good that you raised this. Some of our experience, I also see Angel Central, which is pretty strong. Startup Hub.io, that's one, which is in the angel space. Keiretsu, which is again in the angel space. You can still look into it. There were Reka Next, which was pretty much in the angel space. You have Origin Ventures, which really want to participate as a first kind of an venture investor in Singapore, which is great because they believe in venture building model of taking deep tech ideas from research institutes and IHLs. So that's one I could mention. On the corporate side, I would like to mention few: Infineon Ventures, Schneider Ventures. I believe they probably have one of the largest corporate venture fund in the energy and clean tech and sustainability space. You could also reach out to local large conglomerates. So Semcorp is actively looking for new ideas, but they don't necessarily venture out, but they look at project collaboration. Sabna Jurong with Sabna Jurong Capital. SP Group also looks into investments, but they're all very strategically driven, Charlie. So it's slightly emerging stats from where it was almost 5 years ago to where we are standing today. And also needless to mention on the institutional VC, Wavemaker and Tridec. Tridec is one dedicated clean tech based investors, which we see in Singapore. So I can say that the trend is very positive compared to what it was in the 3 to 5 years. And I think the ecosystem will reward more startups in next 10 years.
And actually, Mahesh, those are all great points. And I
Yeah.
noticed you mentioned a lot of the names of investors that we actually work with.
Yes.
So one other great place to find out which investors are actually participating in the clean tech field is to visit the EcoLabs website and just look at the list of investors that are there. Because if they're on our website and if we're working with them, chances are it's for a clean tech reason.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
wonderful.
Yep.
Thank you very much, Charlie, Mahesh, for such a comprehensive overview and also a few great examples, because I'm pretty sure that most of the participants of this webinar who are looking at it, they're definitely interested to know more names, maybe also to get some details and introductions later on. So now let's proceed maybe with the next part of our discussion and dive a bit deeper, zoom in into pre-seed and seed stage startups and SMEs for a bit earlier stage companies. What are the options available for them? And after your great overview, I think let me start with Mahesh.
Okay.
Mahesh, you mentioned about SG Tech POC, POV grants. So can you give us maybe a few examples, explain in more details what's these grants are for and what's the difference between them?
Yeah, so yeah, POC is basically proof of concept. We define it by in terms of technology readiness level. That's the best way. Technology readiness level has basically 9 levels, where the number 3 basically stands for proof of concept. 3 to 6 is basically you're taking the concept and proving value. That's when the proof of value comes in. And post 7, you're actually trying to do a customer and market capture and market readiness. That's when you have different types of grants. ESG tech, especially SG tech POC, POV, predominantly backs companies which are Singapore SME 30% owned, at least a good tech competency where the tech derived business edge is something they look at. Second, the tech should probably be Singapore founders owned, that the founders should have probably a strong competency in terms of tech which you're looking for. So just an idea which is more like a JV is probably not a go here. So it is predominantly a startup which has great IP backing behind. The founders come from good founding background. These are the background with which you should probably look at POC. That's the first thing. Apart from that, from a founder's perspective, is this the fastest fund? No, it has its very meticulous step in terms of how you go about it. You first need to register your interest with the government. Then the government ESG would probably do a due diligence before you can apply for it. So companies and startups which wants to have a registration of interest, feel free to reach out. We'll probably be happy to do that. Second, it has a very thorough due diligence process in terms of what the business is, how it is going. So you need to clear the due diligence step as well. And then finally, it has a couple of investment panel and committee. The entire process would honestly, right now, it would take easily between 4 to 6 months. That's the time frame you should have in mind before you want to apply for this. The good news is the government is going to push more such encouragements because we are in Singapore. We are in a wonderful place where the government does take care of such institutional innovation and capability in a very systematic way. I perceive it was in the public news by till October 2021, maybe a little stretch to Q1 of 2022, you would see more such applications seen in favor to push local entrepreneurship, especially in the deep tech space for POC and POV. The difference between POC and POV, I would also say in terms of technicality, POC still does not have very strong test bedding and a deployment and a customer validation angle. It has a very strong tech validation angle of it. So you predominantly for startups out there, if you're looking for a very strong tech validation with the customer use for POC, but if you're looking for customer value addition, which is more in terms of determining your techno-economics, reaching a price point, doing a product to market fit, then you should consider doing a POV. And these are very good institutionally driven systems which we have. Apart from that, I think I'll leave the private to Charlie, but there are a lot of also private investors who are actually participating in the POC and POV either through the accelerator route, which is predominantly quite active in Singapore right now, or also through the venture angel group, which backs up early stage ideas which are just spinning off from lab. So it's a very active space. So that's the technical difference between POC and POV. I would touch upon.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Mahesh, for sharing all these details. I think it will be very useful. And just you already started mentioning just a few examples about accelerators and VCs and maybe angels who are also investing from the private side into startups and SMEs. So Charlie, can you also maybe give us a bit zoom in picture, like what role accelerators, angels, and VCs play at this early stage?
Yeah, I can. Look, I think the most important thing that someone should take away from this call is that with the amount of capital that is available in Singapore, every entrepreneur should consider a hybrid approach, especially when it comes to deep tech, especially when it comes to clean tech. That hybrid approach will include dipping into or raising money from the government side through some of those public resources that Mahesh has mentioned, but also then exploring ways to raise money from the private side as well, because they offer different things, and there's tremendous value to be extracted from both. So on the private side, there's the existence of accelerators, and a number of accelerators today provide entrepreneurs with the basic skill sets that they need to scale their businesses. These accelerators, almost 80 to 90% of them, will be focused on a lot of the digital marketing skill sets, or how to build a team, some of the things that perhaps a first-time entrepreneur would require to understand or learn if they hadn't had any sort of formal training at a business school, or haven't had any sort of formal training in their previous roles. That said, there is this small percentage of accelerators who, coincidentally, we work with quite a few of them, who provide a little bit additional value that entrepreneurs can borrow from, and that would be that technical expertise. See, one of the biggest challenges with deep tech is being able to tap into a source of frontier technologies to advance their products as they are, but B, also get a clear understanding about the manufacturing process, the design for manufacturing, or the understanding of how to essentially piece a technology into an existing operation of a corporate, and albeit an industrial environment or something else. So that sort of accelerators, they do exist in Singapore, and that is something that is helpful, but they oftentimes exist because we bolt on to those accelerator programs and provide that expertise. This is an EcoLabs core capability, which is in that technology clean tech space. And for that reason, we are oftentimes bolting on or assisting a lot of VC accelerators to make sure that they don't just teach the softer skills of digital marketing or organizational management, but they're also getting a lot of the more technical and complex skill sets as well. So to answer your question, and I'm sorry, I kind of deviated a little bit from what your question a bit, but at the end of the day, for that early stage stuff, the first place I would start looking is those accelerators. Again, go look for the ones that provide some of that technical expertise as well, because a lot, knowledge is a commodity these days, and oftentimes entrepreneurs can get a lot of it from free online sources. The things that are difficult to find is that technical intelligence and the guidance on how to really scale a technical business.
Yeah, Charlie actually raised I always like this word when you keep saying bolt on, right? So you bolt on to the accelerator. And good that, sorry, Stas, I'm just taking time.
Yeah, go ahead.
I would like to address one particular pain point which exists in Singapore, and probably even the investors would acknowledge, especially in the deep tech, sustainability in the energy space. First and foremost, you'll have to understand energy, even if you're great at product, finally gets bundled down as a project or a solution. That means you need A plus B plus C, where your B is your product, A plus C is something you need to collaborate to get a project done. So it needs a lot more from the tech, from the business. There are huge, massive gaps to take it to the market. First and foremost, knowing, being in the space and having seen clean tech companies in Singapore for almost like 6-7 years consistently, day in, day out, the first thing which I predominantly find a gap is they raise equity money. This is a problem which I find. There's not a problem. It's a bit of a management.
Characteristic.
Yeah, exactly. It's a characteristics, which I would say that they predominantly take it 50% for manpower, which is to feed them, and 30-40% goes into building what they're. But the market do not go this way. Market starts with pilot projects. So that means if the investment goes predominantly building the company, by the time the company starts entering into the market, you don't have projects to do pilots. And be it in Singapore, not every client is willing to give you a 250K pilot projects. It doesn't happen. This is when I think Charlie clearly reached a point of doing hybrid financing for projects. So I would sincerely recommend all the startups to have this clearly in mind when the rate at which you start pivoting from a core tech to commercialization, you need to have budgets to start doing projects, because a project out there is not going to be completely be paid. It's always going to be hybrid. So hybrid, I can give you a classic example. Maybe an investor funds a project, maybe a government agency calls for a grant call, then maybe the company gives the funding. So it's going to be a hybrid financing. You can't just do the translation in an energy with just one pool of funds. And it's unlikely. And your validation is also longer. Your pivoting takes extremely hard because it has a high marginal cost to translate your product into the business. It's not like a software, go back, read it. You're talking about pivoting. And that means high marginal cost, that means high burn rates. So typically, these were some of the early fears of clean tech investment, wave 1, wave 2, wave 3. So I would sincerely suggest the startups and investors to have very clear agenda on piloting and projects and translation. It's a different type. It's a project funding. Also, as Charlie rightly pointed out, focus on hybrid financing. Projects cannot be done by one single source, especially if you're in the early stage. And third, which I would sincerely recommend, is to work with corporate, align themselves to a better demand and project. And so start working with commercial tenders very early with the large companies, because they can cushion out your commercial risk. So I think these are very extremely big gaps when it comes to sustainability. Energy needs to be addressed. And I'm 100% sure it can't be just done by public. It's too much of onboarding for them, or just by private. It needs to have a perfect bridge, especially for clean tech, especially if you're focusing on taking a startup and converting them into a scale up. I'm talking that gap is imminent in Singapore.
Yeah, I echo that opinion. I think, and so one source of funding that I didn't mention, but is something important, is the corporates themselves. I mean, at the end of the day, in order to scale up that business, you need a willing corporate or corporation that's actually willing to not only put money where their mouth is, but to give you the space, the time to adopt the technology, to essentially co-innovate or co-build it with the entrepreneur. Um, all that takes time. And so for that reason, especially in the deep tech category, an entrepreneur is constantly fundraising, because that next amount of cash or that next ticket coming in could be from anywhere, and should be from anywhere. They should be chasing a lot more, working a lot harder on fundraising than the traditional low tech startup.
Yeah, that's I'm sorry. Okay, Stas, I'm again picking up Charlie. Constant fundraising. That reminds me of, I can give you a couple of examples of how a startups generally, there are multiple financing rounds. Stats, when you try to raise $500,000 to 1.5 million, there are little gaps where no one investor fits the bill, because I also need to point out the gaps which may exist at the investor end too. Not everybody comes with energy or sustainability as a portfolio background. Singapore, this space is emerging. That means even investors may have gaps in venture building them, in handholding them, in portfolio building them, understanding where the commercial opportunities. These are genuine gaps which exist because this is a space again which is heating up. So that means you cannot just go, just because you get money, it's great, but you also need to see how best the translation can happen. So that means even investors would piggyback on say something like EcoLabs, or something like Shell, or something like NG Factory, which all are great examples, right? Because you need all these sources to come in so that the investor also feels that, okay, it's aligned. You see the translation, and this space is actually bridging these capabilities as we are talking about at an investor layer, at a startup layer. It's happening. I don't think so this is going to go down. It's going to come and merge much closer as we speak. So typically a startup or an SME should look at multiple bridge rounds in between. Start playing with convertible notes if it's possible, though there are opinions which are against convertible notes. So see if you can go till the first 1 to 1.5 million rounds by not going with valuation, because it's extremely hard to pick a valuation on a clean tech company because the comparables are just not there. To be honest, I think we had discussion even with the government guys. The valuation in US to Europe to Singapore, a significant gap. And you're not getting on par valuations too. And in deep tech, it's very hard to put a number because once it's proven, once it's established, the valuation can go in a different multiples. So I think startups should also be very careful in how they're raising their first 1 to 1.5 million. I think clean tech, I can also point out one more reason. Don't go for too low fundraising because you won't have even money to pivot around. Right. So try to lead in with multiple sources.
That's a really important point, Mahesh, that you bring up. Entrepreneurs need to make sure that and this is another reason why they need to do this hybrid, because in order to take their business from zero to scale is going to cost a lot more than that software business. And so they're going to have a lot more fundraising rounds. And for that reason, and because valuations are unfavorable to those businesses because they reach scale at a lot later date, entrepreneurs need this hybrid approach and live off of grants and customer contracts. One of the best, if you're going B2B, one of the best ways to fundraise is just through customer contracts. Let the customers pay you to develop or critique or tweak the product. So yeah, there's a lot more money an entrepreneur in the clean tech, deep tech space is going to have to raise that makes it a very venture capital alone cannot be the solution.
Wonderful. I like how you covered not only the investment part, but also, challenges that this especially early stage startup facing and how to navigate in this Singapore ecosystem and how to get to the next stage and going to the, from early stage startup into like maybe SME side or just later stage startup. Charlie, maybe you can also touch upon what we discussed just now is about this hybrid model. I think one of the good examples and instruments is co-innovation programs. Can you just share with us and with all participants of this webinar what is co-innovation program, how it works, and how startups can benefit from it?
That's a question directed to me?
Yeah. If you can start.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. Co-innovation programs. So co-innovation programs normally are demand driven, right? They start with the corporate that's got the problem, and every corporate's got a problem. What I encourage entrepreneurs to do is, if their technology can function in a number of different industries, go focus on the industries that are currently under a lot of pressure right now to adopt clean tech solutions. Begin there. One industry in particular that we've noticed that we've actually devoted a lot of resources towards because of this urgency for clean energy is in the maritime space. And so what we've done in the maritime space is we're working with corporates to essentially identify problems, and there's a very clear problem, which is the reduction of emissions either through a vessel or through the operations at a port. And what we do is, once we have identified the situation or the scenario, we then go evaluate the environment. And from that point, we go find startups to work with the corporate in hand in hand. But oftentimes, an entrepreneur will have only innovated on a specific product. And so one of the biggest some really important advice I think that entrepreneurs need to keep in mind is that when they go to a corporate, they need to give the holistic solution. They can't just give one piece or one feature of that solution. And so partnering with someone that is a system integrator, or partnering with potentially a larger corporate that would essentially front the project, and then these startups will complement the back end. Those are the sorts of things that startups need to start looking for. Partnering with consulting firms, partnering with the likes of EcoLabs, who have connections to some of these players that are essentially fronting the projects, is where this co-innovation is the best place for a startup to puzzle piece into the co-innovation project.
Yeah, so just to add to it, I think co-innovation is also tactically a great pilot validation, proof of concept, and proof of project funding raise too, because these corporates, I think Enterprise Singapore itself has a wonderful co-innovation platform. I think you'll hear more during the switch as you'll see more and more corporates in the sustainability space trying to co-innovate, and Enterprise Singapore itself would probably champion it. We ourselves do champion it, working with large companies, and the only reason why we do this is because we first understand the demand, as Charlie rightly understand. It's very important to understand the demand and the strategic direction with which the corporates are looking at. Then we go about scouting the SMEs and startups on the other end, and we look at where the match could happen. And we basically come in to bridge the gaps. The gap could be a resource, could be a lab, could be a technical people, or sometimes project funding too. So it's very important the startups to use this. We see this trend moving up and up. This is not just happening in Singapore. We have clients in Thailand who wants to do exactly what we're doing. We have clients in India. We have clients in UK. We have clients as far as in Korea, who all, and even in Canada, right? So all these guys are basically looking at how we can collaborate at a project opportunity. I think this itself is a great funding gap which the startups and SMEs, even SMEs can leverage, right? SME need not only look at corporate funding, but they can look at project partnerships. We had clients, I'm not naming the company, but we had company which straight away said one thing: I have an energy solution which I'm packaging. I have a gap in X. I have a gap in Y. I have Z, right? So I'm looking for X and Y, which can come from SME. Then I can go and commercially go and bid for a tender or go and bid and deploy a solution. This has been happening. And I think that's a great, another touch point of funding, where a big, large company can cushion the risk of an SME, collaborate together and deploy it. This is something which we love doing. And this is a space I think we significantly like to operate more and more as we are seeing this trend growing up.
Well, I think also to add to that, I mean, oftentimes, and clean tech is still a fairly new concept in a number of industries right now. However, there are a number of corporates that are under pressure to adopt these solutions. So oftentimes, Stas, we will receive a request, which is, I just need to be greener. and that's cool. That's great, because we, working with the likes of someone like us, not necessarily saying us, but working with someone like us means that we've delivered a lot of projects already, and we've coupled these solutions. We've validated a lot of these solutions to work. So for an entrepreneur, I recommend that they do get in touch with someone like us, because we know where the projects are coming from, and the corporates as well. It's not necessary to know specifically what problem needs to be solved, just that the problem needs to be solved, and folks like us can help get that across the line.
Yep. Charlie, I know that you will have to drop off soon because of another commitment, but may I ask you one more question? Also talking about more mature startups and again, available maybe private funding sources. Can you just give us like a few examples and maybe sense what's the difference between raising funds at the early stage of the startup versus, already Series A or pre-Series A? Yeah.
Yeah, it's very different. So funding at the seed stage, the investor will put an emphasis on certain criteria, and then fundraising at the later stage, it becomes different. So the startup at an early stage generally gets away with not having everything organized, not having all the legal contracts in place, employee contracts. The data room itself may not necessarily be perfect. When that company goes into that Series A and above, all that sort of stuff, the expectation is that's all been fixed, that's all gone. There shouldn't be any issues related to that. The financials should be pretty concrete, pretty straightforward. And so investors at different stages are also looking at different things. At that early stage, they're looking at the team and their capability or their ability to take what is a prototype or raw technology and convert it into something that is more commercial, securing that first customer. The Series A guys are looking at, okay, let's look at that same team. Are they able to actually scale the business away from just their singular product class? Can they create a portfolio of products? Can they grow the business internationally? So the skill sets change as well. And it does. It becomes a lot harder and more rigid in terms of expectations. In terms of timing, from a process standpoint, early stage seed accelerators, angel investors. So angel investors are the fastest to make decisions. Second fastest would be your accelerators. Third fastest would be the incubators, VCs, that sort of thing. So the incubators and professional VCs. And the reason why that is because accelerators, angel investors, they're individuals, and because they're singular individuals, they can make a decision quickly. Those accelerators work off of a investment strategy, which is to aggregate as much volume as possible. Out of 10 companies, 1 will succeed, 9 will fail. That's the accelerator model. It's a portfolio model. The investors beyond that stage are being more selective in that process. So with that higher level of scrutiny and selection, ticket sizes increase, but so do the timeline or the cycle time for when an investor can make a decision.
Yep. Okay, Charlie, thanks a lot for your insights. I know that you got to go. So thank you again for participating in this discussion. We'll continue with Mahesh further, but if you have to drop off, please.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks for everyone, and appreciate Stas for you organizing it.
Sure. Thanks for joining us, Charlie.
Your load now.
Okay.
Yeah, you're all left out.
All questions are for Mahesh now.
Oops, okay.
I hope they're tough.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Charlie. Mahesh, while we were talking about Series A startups and like SMEs, be it here in Singapore. So you mentioned during the overview regarding the public funding sources, EDG grant and maybe MRA grant. Can we zoom in a little bit into them? What are these grants? Who should consider them? At which stage?
Yeah. So sure. So if there are SMEs and startups on the call, so early stage startups on EDG would not fit because predominantly it's reimbursement based. And if you have a very strong cash flow issues, then probably should not go for EDG. And EDG is also something which you do it once you hit some early stage revenues. It's much more bankable to build your capability with an EDG grant. Despite that said and done, the government has increased the EDG grant from 70 to 80%. So this itself calls for a more encouraging move by the government. So your basic cash loading is just 20%. But an ideal sizing, I'm giving you numbers and facts to a startup which probably makes it, or an SME which makes probably $10 to $15 million revenue, EDG grant size of 200 to 500K is pretty doable. And they can probably run it around safer, do the cash flow churning. But companies which are less than 5 million and 6 million, they predominantly tend to do projects at lesser volume size, but maybe they can tap on different types of urgencies which we have. So EDG predominantly gets structured into two basic. One, you do product development, which is core capability, right? And or a process building. That's one which you can definitely look at. The second EDG, which I generally like, is the pilot grant because I'm a big believer in demonstrating and deploying it. So look for pilot test bedding EDG grant. Then predominantly the market gaps are big. So you'd like to do a deployment outside, use the overseas market presence grant, which is also part of EDG, which is called OMP. So you play around with these three grant sources which you have, but I would not just recommend these grants. There are more grants which are coming up. The SME should always be open up to grant calls which are coming out from, let's say, the recent grant calls which I can talk about, the EMA, ESG, and the Shell grant, the JTC RFI, which is a commercial tender. That's a very interesting angle, Stas. So JTC invited and request for information for decarbonizing and doing renewable deployment in Jurong Island. And that calls for SME to collaborate with a large company because the project was of significant size. So SMEs can work with a large company. At EcoLabs, we'll be happy to facilitate those discussions because we tend to get these access and get to work with some large reputed companies here. So that's a different type of pool of money which you can tap upon. Right now, the GBIC building grant call, that's interesting. That's for test bedding. So the JTC RFI is more commercial type of a grant which an SME could go after if the product and market is ready. If you're looking for something to test bed and deploy and validate, currently there's a grant call called GBIC, which is opened up. Then if the companies are even less matured, Charlie did mention, say if the sector is fit, let's say maritime, go for some near-term proof of concept and proof of value validation type of a co-innovation grant call. So an SME and startup has to be very clear. Is it looking for commercial kind of a, then there are different opportunities. If you're looking for test bed and deployment, then there are different types of grant calls. And if you're looking at proving your business and proving your concept, you go for co-innovation. Then you have the ESG grant call on a separate end. So it's a mix of what you leverage based on where you are and what your priorities are. We predominantly see too early, the SMEs don't pick it up. They always like to be near to the market, take the deployment in the next 6 months, 12 months, and 18 months time frame. So the priorities of what they choose also changes. So these are some options which I can
I see.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot for sharing about all these nice opportunities.
Sure.
I think, yeah, going further, we still have around 5 minutes before we proceed to Q&A session.
Sure.
And maybe, of course, since we are all aware about all major disruptions happening in 2019 and 2020 in many industries because of the COVID. So Mahesh, how all this situation impacted, the situation here in Singapore, startups, SMEs, and their potential to get private or public sources, because now Charlie is not here, so probably I will ask you to cover both these parts.
Okay.
So what changed?
Okay, from a public funding, it has increased from the government point of view. You are in Singapore, and Singapore really does, the government does a lot in favor to cushion out the risk. So like EDG grant has moved to 80%. The fund allocation of total money, which will go into startup and ESG equity and SG tech and POC and EDG is around $85 million from now. So that's a sizable allocation, which goes to cushion out the SMEs and startup. Singapore is almost like 90% plus in SME market. So the government does a lot to protect in terms of it. I can't paint a rosy picture saying that, oh, let's look at 10 years down the line. Looking at 10 years down the line, this is a decade of sustainability, decarbonization. It's all going great. I personally don't see the allocation for money at a large investment coming down for sustainability. Is the business happening in the near term at a faster rate? No. The transaction has definitely slowed down when it comes to business, because given what we are going through, there's a lot of uncertainty there. But if I have to pick sectors, mobility in the near short term may dip, but electrification won't dip. Renewable integration in the near short term will still be stable, because if you really understand, energy is classified as essential. Even despite COVID, it can't shut down. So that means whether you still go with the same infrastructure or adapt to green infrastructure, it's not going to pivot or stop. So there, I don't see a shortfall happening. But in terms of immediate business deals, closures, there is a gap there. So the government is coming out different ways and mechanism, as you rightly pointed out, EDG, increasing the grant schemes and so forth, cushioning out and so forth. On the private side, surprisingly, if I have to say from an investment, we were lucky because we are seeing all these big energy companies which are transitioning itself from oil to energy. They are coming with a big cash load and declaring themselves to be the next new energy ventures where the big monies are being allocated. We personally work with few, I'm not going to name them, we work with few major energy ventures where they just started a venture fund in the range of $500 million and above. And so the allocation for money is coming. And they are looking for deals, right? So I can give you an example of Thailand company where we work. They are pivoting from a conventional gas to renewables. And that entire journey, there's a big money allocated by the company to move towards it, despite of COVID or no COVID. So those are private money. Schneider Ventures, a classic example, their commitment to this space is strong. And we don't see that dipping. During this space, we also see there's huge interest in next form of alternative fuels, be it hydrogen or be it a different kind of fuel space switch, which can happen in the maritime space and so forth. So that is still pretty active. The dips are largely happening in terms of B2B transactions, which will immediately hit the SMEs and startup in the near short term. But tactically and strategically, it's not a big shift which is shifting against the trend. It's for it. So that's what I see.
Thank you for sharing your perspective, Mahesh. I think
sure.
we're just on time to start our Q&A session. I think we covered quite a lot of ground, starting from early stage startups and what options are available for them to mid-stage startups. So now let me pick a few questions from the floor. We have a few coming up. So the first one is, how can foreign-based startup collaborate with EcoLabs and public-private funding sources?
Okay, so that's an interesting question. Uh, Actually, Singapore itself, before I wear the hat of EcoLabs, Singapore itself has a huge interest to have global companies come to Singapore. One, because it helps the diversity, it gives more better perspective in terms of capability transfer and so forth. Ideally, I'll also tell you, we also have a challenge in Singapore market, why global entry is important before I directly tell you how we can onboard. The Singapore energy space or sustainability space do not produce the same volume of numbers like United States or Europe would produce, because in the United States, you're looking at a number of close to around 5,000 to 10,000 new SMEs and startups being pitched in the space of sustainability. Singapore, it is not the same volume. So that means big company which is trying to collaborate, they are not looking at the same volume of pipeline. Singapore, you're talking about 120. Next year, the incremental maybe another 30 to 40. Deep tech. I'm talking about deep tech. I'm not talking about SMEs per se. So that has a huge shortfall. So that naturally excites companies from outside to come in. So that's why EcoLabs has a strategic interest to help these companies. Despite of COVID, I think we recently brought different companies. Stas, you personally were involved in one company all the way from Ukraine, which is coming up, setting up a base. We have a good relationship slowly emerging with the High Commission of Canada, where we're looking at Canadian startups to be incubated in Singapore. Stas is also working similarly on the Russian ecosystem. We are working on the Indian ecosystem with one of the largest private power grid to move its startup to India. So the way we basically support is we have different sets of services. First, we basically help you with a soft landing entry. We do have co-innovation spaces. Our space is not just hot desking. We have a lab, we have a test bed, we have people to help you with. So generally it starts with a project. So the startup ideally start a discussion with a project. Then it's very tactical to help you with a market entry. Then we know what project can you do, whom you can talk, or which test bed can you deploy, or what kind of resources can you leverage. Yes, we foreign startups are more than welcome. If you ideally have a project, feel free to reach out after this webinar. There are a bunch of services right from entering, legal, financial, to due diligence, to market entry, to project collaborations. We have probably we have a more tiered approach to onboard foreign startups into Singapore. And we have been increasing our presence. I think over the next 2-3 years, we'll probably do more.
Yep. And if you would like to reach out to us, you can always go to the website and drop us a request, or just connect us on LinkedIn. So we'll be always happy to have this discussion. Okay, to the next question. Mahesh, this question related to grants.
Yeah, sure.
It's the question is whether government takes any equity when they're giving away some grants to startups.
Yeah, it depends. If you're going for seeds capital, yes, it's differently structured. If you're going for SG equity, yes, it's differently structured. But generally, it's a convertible kind of an instrument which comes in. It is a minority stake, which generally happens. If it's seeds capital, then they generally follow with a lead investor. So that means it generally follows with the lead investor due diligence. The seed capital basically does a co-funding to it. So they act as a co-investor. So predominantly equity stakes are there. If you're an early stage company, it largely depends on your valuation. So the government is generally always a follow on this side. SC Tech POC is still a very minority stake. So it's not a major concern.
Okay, got it. The following question from Hogan.
Yep, sure.
There are some trend changes related to accelerator programs. What's new trends and where is it moving? So
okay, that's an interesting question, right? So if you really see historically from an accelerator program being very generic, is slowly pivoting to very niche domains. So that's the first pivot which you would see more specific accelerator coming out. A classic example is Techstars, right? Techstars it's almost as good as YC, and Techstars starts a specific program called Energy, and it's doing great. And we have Hong Kong based Brink, which also started out niche verticals. So the accelerator programs also branching out, which Charlie rightly pointed out at the start of the call, is to go into accelerator programs which comes with the technical domain and know-how. That's the first thing which will pivot. The second angle of an accelerator program moving forward which we also see accelerator programs also bridging themselves with co-innovation program, where they're trying to bring and run accelerator program just for large corporates. So they are also extending their arms like a co-innovation thing, which is happening. Three, the accelerator programs, which were typically in the smaller funds, I would see moving forward, they themselves might work with a local, very large entity to bridge the translation funding gap, which an accelerator do not have today. A classic example is the Shell and EMA kind of a collaboration where Shell looks at the corporate angle, EMA looks at the translation angle. The same Shell story with NREL in US is an excellent example where the national lab and a very large private company comes in together to collaborate. So there are different models which we see, which is pivoted from a conventional business model to a very specific, domain specific. It will go further niche. So the accelerator would have more functional expertise and so forth, rather than just being a very generic business function. And especially if the accelerators are deep tech, outrightly it would need technical resources and technical backing and understanding behind it, because the business function of a tech startup comes much later, because there are a lot of pivots interim which happens. So an accelerator with a tech background, it's a great idea. I would also see the accelerator would also collaborate with maybe institutes like us and so forth, where we become a bolt-on, because we don't necessarily run an accelerator, but we run a translator. So we bring resources, we bring project funding, we bring labs, and we do test beds. So that hybrid model of collaborating is something which you can also look for. And finally, I think the internationalization angle of accelerator is something which a startup should consider, which I can give an example. This is for this reason we collaborated with Spark Labs. We are yet to launch this because we realized that we may know what we know in Singapore, but we also have a shortfalls of not knowing other markets. So this international collaboration of moving a startup seamlessly, where the opportunity can be seen at a much global level, especially in sustainability, that's another area where the accelerator can sincerely look at external collaboration and internationalization as a whole.
Nice. Thank you very much, Mahesh,
Yep,
for your insights.
Yep.
And maybe we have the time for one more question. I think this one is a really easy one. The question is, Mahesh, you mentioned several times deep tech startups. How do you define deep tech startup?
Okay, yeah, so that's a good, that's not an easy one. That's a very smart one. So there has been a lot of question on in terms of deep tech startups and so forth. Different people see it differently. I always see it with an inventive step. The inventive step of your technology should be technology based. So that means if you're doing incrementally, the best way to understand, you have 5 best available technologies, and your technology is giving an alternative to compare to 5 best available technologies. And your incremental advantage is coming because of a technical inventive step, which could be protected, which could be scaled. At the same time, it comes with a good founder's tech edge, which gives the business performance. I look deep tech most simple this way, as to whether the job which the technology is supposed to do comes with a solid proprietary IP or a research or a very fundamental understanding of scientific principles and methods, right? So I predominantly see that. And when you say this relatively to others, you would see it with respect to what others are doing. So you can only say deep tech when you know there are 3 more relatively, and yours is better at deep tech. So you can't see it just standalone too. So proprietary IP, a great inventive step, a good scientific understanding that leads to a technical or a business competitive advantage. Google, the fundamental search engine, but behind it, it's a tech competency which is still leveraged as on date to do its business. So we would fundamentally, and that's where the inventive step lies. So I would call deep tech like that. I would just not like to call any other way.
Thank you very much, Mahesh.
AI I think it's not just deep tech for me. Okay.
Wonderful. So we're just on time, and I would like to thank you, Mahesh, and Charlie virtually for joining us for this panel discussion. Yes. I just would like to ask all participants to look out for the feedback form that we'll send after this webinar to help us to improve and to provide you with more relevant webinars, interesting topics in the future. So thank you very much, everyone, for participating. And again, thank you, Mahesh.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure.
See you next time.
Happy to speak to everyone else through email. Thank you all. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks, Tess.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.